Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole. It is Black History Month. Well, you know, I celebrate Black history every week with so many interesting guests, but this month is a special month, and boy, did I find an incredible guest to talk to us, to inspire us. She is the true representation of Dreamleapers. She is a woman who quit her job to pursue a dream that I don't even think she realized that she had at first. That's the beauty of what can happen when you are stirred on the inside. So let me tell you about my guest. Her name is Tara Roberts. I believe that she began her career the same place where I began mine, which was at Essence Magazine many moons ago. Today, Tara Roberts is a National Geographic Storytelling Fellow, and she spent the last few years following, diving with, and telling stories about a group of Black scuba divers. Yes, I said Black scuba divers as they search for slave shipwrecks around the world. Her goal is to reimagine and reframe the origin story of Africans in the Americas and to tell stories that humanize and bring sympathy, empathy, nuance, and complexity to their human journey. Her travels around the world actually turned into a six-part National Geographic produced narrative podcast called Into the Depths. And also, she is on the cover right now of the March 2022 issue of National Geographic magazine. Tara is a journalist, a what's she an adventurer, an explorer, and she is bringing all of that experience to us right now. So please join me in welcoming Tara Roberts.
Hey,
Hello.
Harriet.
It's so good to have you here. And, I'm really curious, Tara, how you went from being a journalist and working in communications to becoming a scuba diver and traveling all over the world in search of these slave shipwrecks. That is definitely a reach. What happened?
Yeah, it was all by accident, Harriet. I definitely did not intend to be a scuba diver, but I happened to be living in Washington, D.C. a few years ago, and it was right around the time that the National Museum of African American History and Culture had opened. And I was walking through the museum. I ended up on the second floor, and on that floor, there was a picture of a group of primarily Black women on a boat in wetsuits. And I had never seen Black women on a boat in wetsuits before. So I was immediately intrigued. And it captured my imagination. Like I'm not I wasn't a scuba diver at the time, but I loved to swim. I loved the ocean. So to see these women engaged in an activity that I'd never seen Black women do before, it really stopped me. So then I looked to learn who are they and what are they connected to, and it turns out that they're part of this group called Diving with a Purpose. And what they did was help search for and document slave shipwrecks. So I was blown away, and I just wanted to be a part of it.
So just the fact that, first of all, that there's this group of Black scuba divers, Black female scuba divers primarily, is a stereotype buster because there is the belief that Black people can't swim, let alone
Yeah,
scuba dive.
yeah.
But then that they would have this incredible purpose, and one of the things that you describe in your podcast as well as in the magazine is that, well, first of all, a lot of people don't even think about the fact that there were slave ships that didn't make it.
Right.
That you know sank to the bottom of the ocean floor, but also that they weren't necessarily valued enough for people to look for them. Can you
Mhm.
tell us a bit about this search for sunken slave ships, and how did it begin, and how did Diving with a Purpose get involved?
Yeah, sure. So a couple of stats that I know completely surprised me. There were 36,000 voyages that brought 12.5 million Africans to the Americas. So 36,000 voyages. And they estimate that as many as 1,000 of those ships wrecked. But to date, less than 10 have been found. So I think that really illustrates the point that there's this huge amount of history out there that just hasn't been prioritized, and that no one was looking for until these divers, and it's divers plus historians plus archaeologists that are
Wow.
doing this work. So it took this new focus to bring this history back into relief so that people were actually searching for it.
That's interesting, Tara, because on the one hand, we know that African bodies were not valued other than if they could make money for folk. But the ships were owned and populated by whites who were moving them across the waters. Interesting that their lives weren't valued enough for the search to occur.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are all kinds of circumstances around the wrecks,
Mm.
and not always are all lives lost. Like
Ah,
in an instance in Cape Town, which the wreck there was found in 2015, there were about 500 Africans on board, all from the Makua tribe, and there's a wonderful story about, how the news of the ship was brought back to the descendants, and this a beautiful ceremony happened. But on that ship, when it wrecked, about half of the Africans, perished, but the crew, made it safely to shore, along with the other half. There's another wreck in Costa Rica. The crew actually set the Africans free on shore, and the crew
wow.
mutinied. They took over because they got lost, they ran out of food, they thought the captain didn't know what he was doing, and so they mutinied on the ship, burned it, and sailed off. So it's not always a loss of life, and it's not always a loss, especially of the crew and the captains.
Okay, that's an interesting qualifier because and it makes sense, Tara, because the Africans were chained. So it's not like they could just if it did sink that they could just float up and
Yeah,
swim, whereas the others were free. I mean, had the physical freedom of moving
yeah,
their bodies. Just the thought of these things, I feel shivers going through my body as you think about what our ancestors went through. And
mm.
so diving with a purpose. Uh, I know you've done so much research about all of this. When were they formed and how did they decide that this was what they would focus on?
Yeah, they have a really great founding story. So, a gentleman named Ken Stewart is the co-founder of Diving with a Purpose. And back in 2003, 2004, he was the Southern representative for the National Association of Black Scuba Divers. So, yes, there is a national
Love that.
organization of Black scuba divers. There are like over 2,000 scuba divers that are
I love
part of
it.
the organization. But so Ken was the representative for the Southern region, and he got a call one day from a woman who introduced him to an archaeologist at the Biscayne Bay Park in Florida. And this woman, she was the lone archaeologist in her park, and she thought she knew where the Guerrero was. And the Guerrero is a Spanish slave ship that was on its way to Cuba and it wrecked in the Keys. So she thought she knew where it was, but she was a lone archaeologist. And you can't dive by yourself. Like it's really important when you dive, you always have a buddy. But she didn't have any buddies. So she was put in touch with Ken, and Ken was like, "Hey, we've got divers." And she was like, "Hey, I can train you on how to help look for shipwrecks, and I need help. I need somebody to help come down and help me search for this wreck." So Ken and a few of the divers came down. Her name was Brenda Lazendorf, and she trained some of them on how to search for shipwrecks. And so Ken decided that day, and he had spent years diving, was super passionate about it. And all of these people inside of NABS, that's the acronym for the National Association of Black Scuba Divers, they loved to dive. but they were all like, "Ooh, is there more that we can do?" And Kim was
Sure.
like, "Yes, this is what we can do. We
There's
can
more, there's
dive with a
more.
purpose." Yeah.
That is so, honestly, many, many great things occur simply because there's a need, right? And then to fulfill that need, that particular need is incredible. Now, in your research, and I guess let's step back. You saw this photo, you got interested, you contacted Diving with a Purpose, but you were not a scuba diver, right?
I was not. Not not
You
even a
said
little bit.
you were interested in swimming, but that's very, very different from
So
being
different.
interested in scuba diving. Um, Tell us about that, the moment of, I want to do this. I want to be with these people and do this because it took a tremendous effort and investment of your whole being in order to get to the place where you could be with them. Tell us about the moment when you figured out that that was what you were going to do.
So I think it started in the museum again. And I don't think I said this earlier, but there was something about those women. Um, they looked like superheroes to me. I've gone back and I've looked at that photo since then, and the photo does not look like what it looked like in my imagination. Like, in that moment, I swear to you, Harriet, it was like those women had on capes, and it
I
was like
love
their
it.
hair was flowing in the wind, and I remember standing there just being captivated and thinking, "Oh my god," like, these are people who look like me, and they have taken on this enormous revolutionary job of finding our history. And so for a second there, I imagined myself doing that, and I could see myself in a wetsuit, like under the water, diving in a
Woohoo!
shipwreck, and I was like, "Whoa, that would be incredible." But I have to say that I didn't actually give myself permission to do that then. When I reached out to Diving with a Purpose that day, and I went out and I called them the next day, but I called them with the thought, not that I could be a diver, but that maybe I could help support them. Because at the time I was doing communications work. I'd actually moved away from storytelling, from being a journalist, and I was doing more, social media, marketing, like that sort of work. And I was doing it for a nonprofit, and it was a nonprofit that supported people who were doing great things in the world. And so I was like, well, I bet they need money and I bet they could use some support. So let me nominate them for a fellowship with my organization.
Oh, nice.
Um, and so anyway, I ended up becoming friends with Ken Stewart, who's the co-founder, and we had a number of conversations. I introduced him to this organization. Ultimately, it didn't work out for him to be a part of it, but he and I became friends, and he invited me. And I think I needed the permission, I needed an invitation to really
Sure.
step into it. And he invited me to be a part of, to come train with them. But to do that, I had to go get my scuba certification. So Ken got me into a class that was being taught in DC. And Ken told me, I did not know this, but DC, he said, was the epicenter of Black scuba diving. That is not something that I'd ever thought about or heard before. But it turns out, like, all the legends of Black scuba diving live in DC. And so he got me into a class taught by the first Black diving club in the country. This club,
Wow.
Harriet, it was started in 1959. Like,
What are
it's
they
been around.
called?
They're called the Underwater Adventure Seekers.
Good,
So he got
good.
me into their class. And again, I was not thinking about telling this as a story. I was like, okay, I'm going to be a part of this. I want to help find our history. I want to just be a part of it. But as I participated in the dive training, which took 3 months, it was weekly classes in the pool. and in this amazing bookstore right up the corner from Howard. It's a Black-owned bookstore and cafe, and the owner is also a member of Underwater Adventure Seekers. So we did our classroom portion there. And over that time, I got to know these divers. And I just want to say for the record, like, they are not paid to help train new people. And as I said, it was twice a week for 3 months, but these people volunteered their time, they volunteered equipment, um, they were so generous. And then they were characters, like hilarious, funny, amazing people who were also super passionate. And many people from that club were also members of Diving with a Purpose. They were instructors, they were on the board. So I really got to know the people behind the scenes. And over the course of that year, it took me a year to, well, I did my scuba training and I did my first ocean dive. Um, and I was like, they are special and somebody should tell people about them. And I was like, oh, wait, I'm a journalist. Maybe that should be me. And so I
Woo,
decided
woo.
then.
That's amazing. Let me remind folks of where you are. All in listening shot of us. You are listening to Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. We are going down a path, a swim, a dive with Tara Roberts, who is a National Geographic Storytelling Fellow and Explorer. She didn't know she was going to be any of those things a few years ago, starting as a journalist and then working in communications, and now the most amazing communications projects, sharing with the world stories about sunken slave ships and being a part of going down to see them, which is just a fascinating thing. So I'm so glad Tara is here. Thank all of you for being here. I told you on Dreamleapers, we bring incredible folk together to hear their stories and be inspired to leap into our own. So Tara, you had that aha moment of, oh, I could do this. I could tell this story. Now you had learned how to scuba dive. So first of all, the invitation that you had received was a leap, because it wasn't just like, oh yeah, come next week to go check this out. In order for you to do it, you had to you had to invest an incredible amount of training and learning, and then you realize your professional skills kick in, and you can use your skills to tell the story. But it required you to quit your job, right? So I think that's quite a challenge and another tremendous leap to go from, oh, this is a nice idea, to having the faith that you could quit your job and everything would be okay. Talk about that.
Yeah. When I decided that I wanted to help tell this story and uplift the divers, and at the time, all I was thinking about was these divers are upending the idea of who Black people can be. And for more people to know their story, like, that just feels inspirational and amazing. Um, and I knew I wanted to follow them because they were doing missions all over the world. And at the time, this was also, so it was 2016, 2017. And I think our world, our country was like, all kinds of issues of identity were at the fore. I wanted to do more work around race. My work in the past had really been centered around women's issues, which I still feel super passionate about. But I really felt like there was more that could be done inside of this racial conversation to bring more healing, more light to the topic. And I decided that felt really important to me. And what I was doing didn't really allow me the opportunity to step into that. And I also missed myself writing. Like, I'm a writer at heart, I'm a storyteller, and I wasn't really doing that. So I decided it took me 2017 to finish the training, scuba certification, to get my first ocean dive in. And then I decided I'm I've got to do this. I don't know what it's going to look like. I didn't have funding. I didn't have an assignment. And I called Ken and I was like, Ken, can I tell your story? And he was like, "Yeah, come on." He calls me Tara Roberts. Ken, by the way, he's 77 years young now. And he was like, "Yeah, Tara Roberts, you come tell that story." And I was like, "Ken, I'm gonna quit my job." And he's like, "Oh, wait a minute. I'm not,
It's like, don't
I'm
put
not
that
taking
on me.
responsibility for that." I was like, "You don't have to worry. I don't know how it's gonna happen, but like I feel really I feel like this is really important." So in 2018, I left to February of 2018. I left my job, and a friend of mine was getting married in India. So I took my little frequent flyer miles. I flew to India, and to participate in Diving with a Purposes training, I had to get 30 ocean dives under my belt. So I decided that I would do a bit of a sabbatical in Southeast Asia. I would dive. I was diving on small boats, like living in hostels, and I would
Wow.
also use that time to meditate, to write in my journal, to really like center myself inside of this mission and to allow my inner voice to help guide me around what the next step would be. So I stayed in Southeast Asia. I was in Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Malaysia for 3 months. I got my 30 ocean dives in. Um, and then I came back and participated in Diving with a Purpose's first training. And that really cemented it for me. I was like, yeah, now this is some special, incredible work. And somewhere while I was in Asia, I had no idea that National Geographic offered grants. Like I didn't know. I didn't know there was a such thing as an explorer. Like I used to read National Geographic magazine as a kid.
Sure,
I loved it. But I never knew what the entree into it was.
sure.
But some sort of way when I was on one of those beaches in Southeast Asia, like something showed up in my inbox that told me that they offered grants to. And they had just started, Harriet, a storytelling track. Like before, they gave grants to scientists, like
Right.
to people who I'm not a scientist.
Sure.
I'm not a historian. Like I'm none of those. I'm a storyteller. And they had a storytelling track and they
That's
gave grants to
amazing.
storytellers that wanted to tell stories about human journeys in the environment. And I was like, the ocean, slave shipwreck, like it's a journey. So I ended up applying for a grant.
Perfect, right? Just
Perfect.
perfect.
Yeah.
But this is how the world works. And so everybody who's listening, we do know this in the back of our minds, but when you put your heart into something, when you're connected to spirit in that way, it's like suddenly things get easy and the support that you need shows up like it showed up in your inbox. And I think it took tremendous faith for you, faith in yourself and in the belief that what you were pursuing was worth it in order to you know quitting your job is not an easy decision to make for most people, but to follow this inner churning of yours and then to be rewarded. You put in a tremendous amount of effort, and what happens that that the grace comes in. I learned that there are two wings of a bird: self effort and grace. And the bird can fly when you put in the effort and then you welcome grace it. And that's, whatever your spiritual following is, it doesn't really matter.
Mm,
That concept, I think, is true.
mm.
And there you are, really showing that to us, which is incredible, Tara. So you apply for this fellowship, the storytelling fellowship, tailor made for you, and, and got it. So when you got the fellowship, then you had funding. Did that mean that you could then follow along with uh, the scuba diving group to go to different dives that they were conducting?
Mhm. Yeah, I applied, and at that time, it was just a grant. I applied for it, I think, in May, and then the training was in June, and I was like, "I will find a way to travel with them." Like, they were doing missions in Mozambique, South Africa, Senegal, Costa Rica, St. Croix, around the U I was like, "Maybe I can just go out to one and come back." I spent the summer sort of beginning to map it out. And I was planning to make it happen whether I got funding or not, but it wasn't until September that I got word from National Geographic that I had gotten the grant. And so I was like, "Well, now that worked itself out. Woo!
Really? Yeah.
Yay." So I decided, and I got permission from all the parties necessary to join them on a mission that they were planning for December. So I could take time to sort of plot it out and get started. And my goal was to stay on the road now that I had funding. And it was a small grant, but it was enough to cover me traveling, following them around. So I ended up leaving end of November for Mozambique, and I went with this big team. And that's where the journey started.
And so, Mozambique, take us into Mozambique and that first shipwreck that you found. Were you able to actually go down and see the shipwreck?
Yeah, so the work that's in Mozambique is actually connected to the wreck that's in South Africa. Um, Even though I was able to dive in Mozambique, but they're still trying to identify what those artifacts are on the floor. And I should say for listeners and for you to know that most of these wrecks are not intact. So they are
That makes
pieces
sense.
on
Yeah.
the ocean floor, and they're very hard to see because most of the pieces are encrusted in coral, or they've been made into homes by marine life, or they're covered by sand on the ocean floor. So it's very hard to find them. But in Mozambique, they'd found a wreck in South Africa, in Cape Town, in 2015, and they discovered that that wreck started, or that ship started, in Mozambique, and that the people who were in the hold were from the Makua ethnic group. So the work that they were doing in Mozambique was really connected to descendant work, to memory work, and it was incredible. I'll just tell you this really brief
Please, we want to know.
story about was it okay. It's like, yeah, this is all right. So let me just tell you.
Yes.
um, so when they discovered this wreck, and discovered that it came from the Makua, or that the people who were in the hold were of the Makua ethnic group, the team, and it's the National Museum of African American History and Culture, has this project called the Slave Wrecks Project, and Diving with a Purpose is a member or a part of the Slave Wrecks Project. So it's really, this is a mission that's being led by them. But they decided to bring word of what happened to the ship back to the descendants in Mozambique. And so when they went back, this is what's amazing, is that the Makua ethnic group celebrated this news. They had a big ceremony with dancing and music and speeches. And at the end of it, the Makua chief handed the team a sacred vessel that was made out of cowrie shells. And he put sand or soil from Mozambique into the vessel. And then he gave it to the team, and he charged them with the mission of going back to South Africa and distributing that soil on the wreck site so that his ancestors could touch home for the first time in over 200 years. And so the
Ooh,
team, right? And so the team went back and they did that. They did the ceremony, and they chose an African American, a Mozambican and a South African to distribute the soil. And one of the African American was a member of Diving with a Purpose. And when he tells the story, he says that when they went out early that day, it was a horrible day. Like it was stormy, it was cloudy, the ocean was turbulent. They had to hold on to each other to get out there. He says, and he's like, I'm not lying. When they distributed the soil on that site, he said the sun came out and the seas calmed. So it was a way that the ancestors heard. I
Wow.
wasn't there for the ceremony, but I went afterwards. I met the Makua chief.
Mhm.
And then I went to South Africa and I sat at the wreck site because it's also a very dangerous site in general. It's super cold water, super turbulent. But I sat there and I could imagine, one, I could imagine what it was like over 200 years ago. The ship went down at like 2 a.m. in the morning. So it was dark, cold, the waves are crashing. Even that day, it was a sunny day that I sat there. I could feel the spray of the ocean all the way up on shore. It was that powerful. So I could imagine what it was like for them below. But I also could feel the energy from that ceremony. And so that spoke to me of healing. It spoke to me of closure. It spoke to me of something really powerful happening. And that I think is the power of this work of searching for slave shipwrecks.
Wow. Hey guys, we are talking to Tara Roberts. She is a National Geographic Storytelling Fellow and explorer, a true explorer. She is devoted right now to exploring slave shipwrecks and telling the story so that we can understand a part of our history that many people honestly haven't even thought about. And she's been diving her project Into the Depths, which is a National Geographic cover story. She is on the cover of the March 2022 issue, and she's also created a podcast series telling these stories. It's just really incredible. You are listening to Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. And I want to share with all of you who are listening, this fellowship, this family of listeners and storytellers, we exist because of your support. We do not accept commercials. We willingly, gratefully accept your donations because we are listener sponsored radio. We are 62 years old, you guys. It's amazing that through COVID, through many other things, but especially COVID, because many, many businesses lost their way, lost their ability to stay alive. And we are alive and thriving. And it's literally all because of you. And so we invite you to make a contribution today to WBAI. You can call us at 212-209-2950, and you can become a BAI buddy. That means you give a monthly contribution of any amount. It can be small or large. You can make it in honor of this program, Dreamleapers, again by calling 212-209-2950. You can also go online at give2 WBAI.org. The point here, because we're now in February, the shortest month but the richest month, where we are all focused on talking about the contributions of African Americans to the world, really. And this particular story that Tara Roberts is sharing with us just is eye opening on so many levels. Learning about aspects about slavery. People are so scared to talk about slavery, and it's part of our history. So we might as well talk about it and learn about it. And then for people today to devote their lives, time, energy, effort to make sure that we understand what's really going on. This is really fortunate that you are doing this work, Tara. We appreciate it, and just want everybody to know Into the Depths right this minute exists on the cover. It's a big cover story of National Geographic for the March 2022 issue and a podcast series. And we're going to talk about that podcast in a minute. But again, we need you. We need your donations. Please call us 212 209 2950 and contribute whatever you can to ensure that we stay on the air for 62 more years, right? So, Tara, in the first episode, podcast episode of Into the Depths, you take us on a journey, telling kind of how you came to get involved in this and what it's all about. One of the things that you mentioned, which um, came up for me again as you're telling this story, is about the it is about spirituality. So your mother's minister comes and you point out you're not a big church girl. Your mom is, but you're not. And he came and gave you some perspective on the ancestors, which you just were talking about, the power of the ancestors. And I'd like for you to talk about how your understanding of that spiritual power kind of changed, transformed. You had a greater awareness based upon your experiences.
Things shifted for me when my mother's pastor spoke to me. I was thinking about this work, thinking it was really important, thinking that these were stories of the divers. Of course, I knew that there were stories of the ships and the people who were on them, but I don't know that I was thinking about it quite on that level until Bishop Jack Bomar of Hillside International Chapel and Truth Center in Atlanta, Georgia, came to my mom's house. And he didn't know what work I was doing, but my mom is a big PR agent of mine. And she's like, Bishop Jack, let me tell you what Tara's doing. You got to bless her journey. But he gladly did that. And there was a moment when he looked at me and he was like, you have been called. And I had not thought about it like that. He said, you have been called. And he was like, it is important right now for you to ask the ancestors to help guide your way. You have to speak their names, Tara. Speak their names, speak their names, speak their names. And him presencing them opened up something for me. And it deepened my understanding of this work, of this history, and of an approach to it. So what we do inside of the podcast is we try to speak their names. I don't know if listeners will know this stat. This is one of the stats that also sort of blew my mind, but 1.8 million Africans died in the Middle Passage. Let me repeat that number. 1.8 million Africans died in the Middle Passage. Who's mourning them? Who's grieving them? Where's the memorial? We're not talking about 5 people, 10 people, 1,000 people, even 100,000 people, which is a lot and tragic. We're talking about 1.8 million people whose lives were lost in this journey. They say that the Atlantic is one of the most turbulent of all the oceans, and that it is because of the lost souls who haven't been put to rest. So what Bishop Jack gave to me is a realization that this work is an opportunity to acknowledge, just acknowledge that these lives were lost, and then to honor them and to try to bring them back into memory. There's so many stories about Black pain, Black trauma, Black death. There's less about Black life. And so what we try to do is bring their stories back to life in the podcast.
And the podcast is really beautifully executed. I just want to say, it's emotional. It's filled with facts and figures, which I think is important so that people get perspective. It's personal. You're in one aspect that is personal. I'd like for you to talk about a little bit because it's personal to you, but also something that others can think about. you know, and you told me the other day about pictures coming to life on the wall in your mother's house that had just been there. And I think that for many of us alive right now, we don't even pay attention to the folks on the wall. Oh, that's grandpa, whoever, that's grandma, that's auntie, whoever. And we don't take the time to know their stories. And this project helped you to bring family members to life. Can you talk about that?
Before this project, I was one of those persons who was a bit afraid to look back. Um, I didn't want to revisit our past because I felt like it was so painful and so traumatic. And so I avoided books, movies, anything dealing with slavery. I was like, what else is on? Let me watch some reality TV instead. Um, and I didn't even realize that that was a problem or that there was anything not okay with that. It wasn't until I started doing this work, and particularly until I started to meet descendants of the ancestors who were on those ships, and in particular, the people from the Clotilda. The Clotilda is the ship that was found in Alabama, Mobile, Alabama in 2019. So it's the most recent ship to have been found. And I thought that their story was going to be a hard story and it was going to make me really sad. But what I found when I went and I talked to those descendants was strength and confidence and power. And it was because they knew where they came from and whose they came from. They had stories. They know exactly who their ancestors are because their ancestors went on to build a community in Mobile, Alabama called Africatown. So these were
Yeah.
enslaved people who 5 years, after being brought here from West Africa, from Benin, founded their own community, and that community still exists today. So something shifted deeply inside of me once I met the descendants of the Clotilda, and it made me think, "Oh, well, can I trace my own roots back to a slave ship?" And so that had me go back to the pictures on my mother's wall, and my mother is a big fan of her ancestry. She's the keeper of the family tree. And so she's got all these pictures. And like you said, these were pictures that I have passed by and maybe like mildly curious, but not really, mainly indifferent. Like, oh, okay, those are those ancestors there. But because of this work, because I met those descendants, I decided to hire a genealogist as a part of the project and see how far I could trace back. And of course, I could not trace back to a slave shipwreck. Any genealogist that specializes in African American history will tell you that most Black folks hit what's called the 1870 brick wall. And before that, the US Census did not count identifying details of enslaved people. So it's very hard for us to trace back. Um, but I had my ancestor, great great grandpa Jack, who does sit on my mother's wall. So we knew that he existed. But the genealogist was like, well, maybe we can find out more about Jack. Maybe I can find Jack's parentage. And if we find his parents, maybe that'll help you get further back. We weren't able, like, spoiler alert, we weren't able to find out his parents. But she found out information about Jack that I did not know. And my family didn't know. Like, we hadn't done that level of research. It turns out my ancestor Jack, who was born in 1837, so he was born enslaved, managed to amass over 175 acres of land. He
Wow.
also he fought in the Civil War. Like, I did not know this. He was a part of the United States colored troops. There are all these things to be proud of my great great grandpa Jack. And I had been afraid to look back because I didn't want to face the fact that he had been owned by somebody. Like, I was afraid of that information. But Jack's life was more than a life about enslavement. And so there was a lot of power in
And Tara, you just hit on something that I think is true on both sides of the aisle. Look, there can't be people like us who can find enslaved family members without white folks who can find enslavers. And I think that's part of the reason why this history is not researched the way that it should be, because there's a lot of shame about shame and pain on the
Mhm.
other side, that, well, I don't, I didn't do that. And well, if you go back far enough, probably there are family members who did. Not everyone, but many, because slavery was the oil that fueled it all. Um, and people are afraid for different reasons. So I appreciate so much that you were able to push past your fear by immersing yourself in this project in this way. I just want to remind folks you're listening to Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. We are just so grateful to be able to talk to Tara Roberts about her project that she has committed her heart, soul, life, resources, everything into. It is called Into the Depths, a project that National Geographic has helped her to make her dream come true in really bringing incredible storytelling to us through the 6 episode podcast series, and also the cover story of National Geographic for the March 2022 issue. I want to invite all of you one more time to donate to our radio station where we today. So Tara, the time goes by so fast. We've got a few minutes left. I want to talk about the reaction that you have received in doing this work, both from Black colleagues and family members and white folks who are learning. Because I think we're all learning. This is new information for most of us. What has that experience been like?
It has been amazing. Um, there's been an eagerness. Like, I was nervous that people would respond to this work the same way that I responded to stories of slavery and the slave trade. But what I found is there's an eagerness and a desire to hear more, to learn more. And I think it's because we enter into the story in a different way. Like, we enter through adventure, we enter through the ocean. And it's an unexplored, unexamined part of this history. And so I think yeah, the response has been incredible. People, I just did a talk last night with a group of STEM families. It's mainly Black and Brown families, and they're 6 to 11-year-olds. And the 6-year-olds were like, "Well, what is it like underwater?" And
I
I'm like,
love
"Put
it.
your mask." Yeah, I think that there's so many parts to this. One, it's seeing these divers that we don't often see. So you've got Black people doing stuff that you're like, "What?" And there's adventure and exploration inside of that. Then there's agency in being the ones to say, we're going to go find history. Like, there's a historian at the National Museum of African American History and Culture named Mary Elliott, who said in one of the interviews, she said, "We didn't forget about you. We came to find you." Like, how powerful is that? That's another way to enter into conversations about slavery. Of course, there are sad notes and there are tragic notes. It's a tragic history. But the way that we're approaching it, I think, is through healing, through closure, through honor. And that feels different, I think. And I think people are hungry for that. So on both sides, black sides,
Yeah,
white sides, people are like, I want to know more.
that's incredible. And also what I see is because of your way in through that photo that's in that museum, it also shows people how to use a museum. A lot of times people go to museums and like, oh, that looks nice. That's that. Look at that beautiful piece of artwork. That's nice, but it's not not often interactive. Very rarely does the interactivity continue when you step out of the museum. But so many people were so hopeful that this museum would be impactful and would matter because look, it's been how many hundreds of years, and then finally we have this incredible museum that is so beautiful and as big as it is not even close to big enough to house as much information as it should. But your telling about that photo and what it has meant for you, I think can be helpful for others as they go to the museum and say, what will speak to me and what can I do with it?
Hmm. Well, I never thought about it like that, Harriet. That's yeah. Yes.
Well, because as you have described, and I think you talk about this in the podcast, it's a challenging experience going through that museum, especially on the ground floor, because you are in the bowels of slavery, right? And taking it from there into the water, into the depths, um, uh, is a powerful experience. What are your plans moving forward?
Hmm. When I started this journey, my first grant was to write blog entries. It's like 200, 300 word pieces. And very quickly, I realized there's no way that you can deal with this history in 200, 300 words. So then it advanced into doing a podcast and doing the story. And there's so many more stories to tell. Like, I still feel like I haven't touched the meat, like the deep meat of this work. So I hope to work on a book about it. There are also, I think I said that there are as many as 1,000 wrecks out there. We've only found like less than 10. So there are a lot more wrecks to be found. Um, there's a lot more history to be explored. One of the things that I, and I have to say, like, I wasn't thinking like this either, but I am now understanding the Middle Passage and the global slave trade newly. Um, there were 4 continents involved in the slave trade. It's Europe, Africa, South America, North America. This idea that it's Black people's history and that it is a footnote to our experience today is something to really counter and challenge. This slave trade went on for over 400 years. Do you know, like, cultures were transferred, religions, beliefs. This was a monumental event in our history. The world looked completely different before the slave trade.
That's
400
right.
years later, it looks different, and it has built the foundation of our economy and our society today. So that this is not a major um, point to be explored in our history books doesn't feel okay to me. And I feel like there's more work to be done in the education space around bringing this history into the light so that we can examine it and understand it more.
What I appreciate a lot about the way that you are offering the storytelling is that it is welcoming. Because this is a very tough topic. There are times as you listen to the podcast that you well up just because, hey, these aren't pretty stories, they're real stories. And I think being able to create safe space for people to dive in and learn is important because it can certainly help with the dialogue. Tara, where can people find Into the Depths?
Hmm. So it's on all podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcasts. and it
Mhm.
drops, new episodes drop every Thursday through March 3rd. So I think today, an episode 4 drops today.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so proud of you watching your career as it has evolved over the years and for you to find purpose in this way and to get the support that you deserve.
Yeah.
We look forward to seeing more, to listening to Into the Depths, and to seeing what's next for Tara Roberts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harriet. And this totally, like, what, I don't know how many years ago, but you and I in the halls of Essence Magazine together, and
Yes,
we were there at the same time,
we
and it
were
was the
there.
place where I started, so it's crazy
Yeah.
to
It's
reconnect.
where I started and where you started, which is
Yep.
pretty amazing. And just to that point, because Essence has documented Black history beautifully since 1970 when it started. And each of us who's had the opportunity to work there has been trained well and gone on to do great things. It was certainly an incredible platform. And I know we have to call Susan. Susan Taylor is proud of you right now, girlfriend, for all that you are doing. So
Oh
thank you
god, we have
very,
to send
very
Susan
much.
some love. Yes. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you today here on Dream Leapers. Please make a contribution 212-209-2950. We appreciate you. Let us celebrate each other and learn how to leap into our dreams because when we do that, the world is a better place. Until next time, have a great day and make it count.